Mayday. Mayday. This is Olympus 7. We are blind. Repeat. We are blind. The voice tore through her headset like a scream in the dark, and in that instant, Major Callan Ashford, the pilot the Air Force had tried to erase, the woman exiled to freeze at the edge of the world, knew she was the only thing standing between a dying plane and a mountain range that showed no mercy. She didn't hesitate. She never did. Because 30,000 feet below, inside a shattered cockpit with no instruments and no hope, a stranger's life was already slipping away. And somewhere behind her, in a storm thick enough to swallow the truth whole, an enemy she couldn't yet see was waiting. Waiting to make sure Olympus 7 never landed. Waiting to make sure Callan never found out why. Mayday. Mayday. This is Olympus 7. We have suffered catastrophic decompression. We are blind. Repeat. We are blind. The words hit the frozen air over Ironvale like a gunshot. And somewhere above the churning black wall of the storm, a woman nobody wanted was the only one listening. But that comes later. First you have to understand what it cost her to be up there at all. 3 years earlier. A different sky. A hotter one. The desert beneath Callan Ashford's wings had a name most Americans couldn't find on a map. Kestron. A sliver of scorched earth wedged between two countries that hated each other more than they hated anyone flying overhead. Which was saying something. Because everyone up there that night hated something. Captain Callan Ashford. 28 years old. Green eyes that didn't blink when they should have. A voice that stayed level when the world around her was screaming. She flew an F-15E Strike Eagle like it was an extension of her own nervous system. Instructors at the weapons school still used her call sign as a verb. To rook something meant to do the impossible and make it look like Tuesday. That night, Tuesday came for her anyway. She was leading a two-ship patrol. Routine. Boring. Even. Except nothing stayed boring in Kestron airspace for longer than 4 minutes at a time. Because at 140 hours local, an encrypted burst transmission tore through her headset. Force Recon Team. Call sign Cutlass. 11 Marines pinned, surrounded. Outside the designated patrol sector by 6 clicks. Which meant officially they didn't exist. Which meant, officially, nobody was coming. Except somebody was already listening. Colonel Marcus Holloway's voice arrived a heartbeat later, sharp enough to cut through the static. Hold your airspace. Do not engage. Rescue assets are 30 minutes out. 30 minutes. Callan did the math before he finished the sentence. She always did the math first. It was the thing that made her dangerous and the thing that made her insubordinate. And on that particular night, those two things turned out to be the exact same thing. 11 Marines. 30 minutes. Do the math. Cutlass wouldn't have 30 minutes. Cutlass would have maybe 12. And then Cutlass would have nothing. 11 names on a wall in a town none of them chose to die defending. So she made a decision. The kind of decision that ends careers or saves lives. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, does both at once. She keyed her mic and said 4 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. Rook is going in. Then she cut the feed. Faked a comms failure that fooled absolutely no one who mattered. Rolled her Strike Eagle inverted, dropped into a ravine too narrow for sane pilots to consider, and went to war without permission. 12 minutes, that's how long it took. 12 minutes of low-altitude fury that scorched sand into glass beneath her afterburners. 12 minutes of enemy armor turning into twisted, smoking wreckage 1 heartbeat at a time. 12 minutes that 11 Marines would spend the rest of their lives being grateful somebody broke the rules. She saved every single one of them. And Colonel Holloway wanted her court-martialed for it. That's the part people never understand. The part that keeps Callan awake some nights even now. You can save 11 lives and still be the villain in someone else's story. Because Holloway's story wasn't about the Marines. It was about a multi-million-dollar aircraft exposed to unauthorized risk. It was about a chain of command that couldn't function if captains started deciding for themselves which orders were worth obeying. He wasn't wrong exactly. That was the worst part. He wasn't wrong. A quiet compromise was reached to avoid a media circus nobody wanted. No trial, no headlines, just erasure. Callan was stripped of her combat status. Quietly, efficiently. like pulling a tooth that had already gone dead. Demoted, reassigned, exiled to the edge of the world to fly aggressor missions against green lieutenants until either her spirit broke or her enlistment ran out. They were betting on the spirit. They lost that bet. Because Callan Ashford didn't know how to quit. Nobody had ever taught her. Her father certainly hadn't. Which brings us to Iron Vale. Joint Base Iron Vale sat at the ragged northern edge of Alaska, like something the map had forgotten to finish drawing. Wind that could strip paint off a hangar door. Nights that swallowed the sun for entire seasons at a time. A place where legends went to freeze. Where careers went to be quietly buried under snowdrifts nobody bothered to shovel. To the top brass, Callan was a liability wearing a flight suit. A cautionary tale they kept around to remind young pilots what happened when you stopped trusting the chain of command. To the enlisted crews turning wrenches on the flight line, she was something else entirely. She was a god who'd been exiled to their frozen little corner of purgatory, and they intended to make the most of it. Master Sergeant Dale O'Malley had been at Iron Vale for 11 years, long enough to watch 4 squadron commanders come and go. Long enough to know exactly which pilots deserved his respect and which ones were just filling a seat until retirement. He'd decided about Callan inside her first week. She's the real thing, he told his crew chiefs. Don't let the paperwork fool you. The paperwork said aggressor pilot. 3rd string. A punishment posting. The truth was something the paperwork couldn't measure. The truth lived in the way Callan pre-flighted her own aircraft, even though regulations didn't require it. The way she memorized every green lieutenant's call sign inside a week and used it like she meant it. The way she flew red air against F-35s, with a ferocity that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with a woman who simply didn't know how to fly any other way. But there was another truth underneath that one. A quieter one. One that only O'Malley had pieced together, and only because he'd been at Iron Vale long enough to remember a name Callan never mentioned out loud. Ashford. Colonel Everett Ashford. 8 years dead. A training accident, the file said. A mid-air malfunction during a routine exercise over the Brooks Range. Cause undetermined. Investigation closed. Case number sealed under a classification that made even O'Malley's clearance level useless. Callan hadn't requested Iron Vale by accident. She never said it out loud. Not to O'Malley. Not to anyone. But he'd watched her stand at the edge of the flight line some nights, staring north into the mountains, where her father's aircraft had gone down 8 years earlier, and he understood something about grief that most people never learn until it's their turn to carry it. Grief doesn't ask permission. It just moves in and rearranges the furniture. She'd been quietly requesting the accident file for 6 months. 6 months of denials. 6 months of records officers telling her the file was sealed pending an investigation that had officially concluded almost a decade ago. Which made no sense. Except very little at Iron Vale made sense once you started asking the wrong questions. That's what this story is really about in the end. A woman who kept asking the wrong questions. And a sky that finally decided to answer her. On the night everything changed, the temperature on the tarmac read 35 degrees below zero. A Category 5. Supercell was rolling in off the Bering Strait, thick and black and hungry, grounding every commercial flight within 400 miles. Even the military was hunkering down. Even the wolves, O'Malley liked to joke, had better sense than to be out in that. Except Callan. Because Callan Ashford had a training rotation scheduled against 2 F-35s, and nobody at Iron Vale had the authority to scrub it just because the sky looked like the end of the world. Weather's looking like a meat grinder up there. Major O'Malley shouted over the shriek of wind rattling the hangar doors. He'd finished his final walk around 20 minutes ago. He was still standing there anyway. He always stood there a little longer than he needed to before Callan flew. Some habits you don't examine too closely. Callan was already strapped into the cockpit, helmet resting against her thigh, green eyes scanning the glowing multifunction displays with the kind of stillness that unnerved people who didn't know her. "I've flown in worse, Chief," she said. "The rookies need to learn how to fight when the sky is trying to kill them." O'Malley grinned despite himself, tapped the fuselage twice, an old ritual. Half superstition, half affection. We're wheels up in 5. He didn't say the other thing. The thing he thought, every time she climbed into that cockpit, that she wasn't just a pilot, she was something rarer. A savant of the sky, the kind that comes along once in a generation and gets wasted flying red air for lieutenants who'd never know how lucky they were to lose to her. 5 minutes later, Callan's F-16 punched through the freezing rain and tore into the cloud cover, turbulence rattling her teeth hard enough to hurt. The altimeter spun as she climbed through 30,000 feet, breaking free of the storm into that strange, eerie silence above it. Below her, the clouds churned like something alive. Lightning flickered inside them, illuminating the storm from the inside out, a monster with a heartbeat made of electricity. She was 90 seconds from her rendezvous point when the frequency changed. It wasn't the training channel. It came in raw and unencrypted, bleeding across the military UHF band like a wound that refused to close. Mayday. Mayday, Mayday. This is Olympus 7. We have suffered catastrophic structural failure, explosive decompression, dual-engine rollback. We are blind. Anchorage Center. Do you copy? Anybody? Do you copy? Olympus 7. Callan's hand froze over the throttle. She knew that call sign. Olympus wasn't a civilian designation. It belonged to a very small, very specific category of aircraft. C-32 Alphas. Military variants of commercial airliners used almost exclusively to move senior government officials and classified cargo across contested airspace with a level of discretion that ordinary transports couldn't offer, which meant somebody important was up there. Somebody important and dying. She flipped her radio switch before she'd finished thinking the thought all the way through. Old habit. The kind that had gotten her in trouble before and would probably get her in trouble again. Olympus 7, this is Rook 1-1. I have you loud and clear. State your position and status. Beat of static. Then a voice, young and ragged and barely holding together. Thank God. This is First Officer Reyes. The captain is unconscious. We took a hit. Something slammed into the starboard side. We've lost all navigational instruments. The glass cockpit is dark, no radar, no attitude indicator. We're descending into the storm and I don't know where we are. We took a hit. 3 words. Callan repeated them silently, feeling something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. You didn't lose instruments in a lightning strike. You didn't lose an entire glass cockpit to turbulence. Something had hit that aircraft. Something deliberate. She switched frequencies before the thought finished forming. ANR command, this is Rook 1-2-1. Do you have a track on Olympus 7? The watch commander's voice came back tight and fast, the particular kind of fast that meant a room full of people had just started running. Rook 1-2-1, this is ANR control. We just lost their transponder on primary radar. They're somewhere over the Brooks Range, descending fast. Rescue choppers are grounded by the storm. You are the only asset in the air within 300 miles. The only asset within 300 miles. She didn't hesitate. She never hesitated. That was the thing about Callan Ashford that scared people who never had to trust their life to someone else's split-second judgment. Hesitation got people killed. She'd learned that lesson in a Kestrel ravine 3 years ago, and she'd never forgotten it since. She slammed the throttle forward. Full afterburner. The F-16 screamed, shuddering violently, as it plunged back down into the churning black heart of the storm she'd only just climbed above. The canopy iced instantly, then cleared as the environmental system blasted hot air across the glass. Outside there was nothing. No horizon. No stars. Just thrashing, violent darkness in every direction. A void that wanted to swallow her whole. Olympus 7, I am inbound on your last known vector, she said, and made her voice a lie. Calm. Steady. A psychological anchor for a terrified man 300 miles from anyone who could actually help him. Reyes, listen to me. Keep your wings level. Don't trust your inner ear. In a storm like this, your equilibrium will lie to you. Whatever backup analog gauges you have left, trust those instead. I can't see them, Rook. The backup electrical bus is fried. It's pitch black in here and the wind is deafening. We're bleeding altitude, 18,000 and dropping. We're going to hit the mountains. The Brooks Range. jagged granite peaks scraping the sky above 9,000 feet, utterly unforgiving to anything that wasn't a bird. If Reyes didn't level out soon, Olympus 7 would be shredded across 100 miles of avalanche country, and whoever was on board would be scattered pieces in the snow by morning. "You are not going to hit the mountain," Callan said, her eyes already scanning her own radar display, fighting through heavy meteorological clutter that turned the entire screen into an angry green fog. "I am going to find you. What's your airspeed? 200, maybe 210. The yoke is heavy. Hydraulics are bleeding out," she swore under her breath, because a fully loaded Boeing airframe flying at 200 knots with failing hydraulics wasn't an aircraft anymore. It was a brick with wings, waiting for gravity to remember it existed. "A&R command, give me a hard vector," she demanded. "Rook 1-1, we're trying to paint them with ground radar, but the cell's too dense. You'll have to find them visually, or with your onboard systems." She was flying blind at 900 miles an hour through a mountain range that didn't forgive mistakes. She closed her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, long enough to picture the map in her head, the wind speed, the descent rate of a crippled aircraft losing altitude in a storm that didn't care what it destroyed. She banked hard left, pulling 6 Gs, the weight of her helmet dragging against her strained neck. She flipped her HUD to infrared, staring through a grainy green feed on her helmet-mounted display. Come on, show me your heat signature." A faint thermal bloom flickered at the edge of her screen. Irregular, one engine burning twice as hot as the other, a trail of leaking fuel freezing instantly in the frigid air behind it, a ghost trail marking a wound in the sky. "Reyes, I have you on thermal. I'm 3 miles off your port quarter, closing fast." She throttled back, deployed her speed brakes, closed the distance to the massive shadow of the crippled C-32A. And when a flash of lightning finally illuminated the fuselage, she understood exactly why the instruments had died. The entire starboard side, just aft of the cockpit, had been torn open. Metal peeled backward like the lid of a tin can, jagged edges glinting in the strobing light. It wasn't metal fatigue. It wasn't an engine failure that had simply gotten out of hand. She'd seen damage like this before, over a different desert, a different lifetime. Shrapnel scarring, a proximity warhead detonated close enough to the hull to tear it open without destroying the aircraft outright. Somebody had shot at Olympus 7, which meant somebody was still out there. She slid her F-16 to within 20 feet of the Boeing's wing, an insane maneuver in near-zero visibility, and flipped on her landing lights. The beam cut through the storm and lit up the shattered cockpit like a searchlight, finding a drowning man. First Officer Reyes, young. Blood streaked across his face. Both hands locked white-knuckled around a control column that was fighting him for every inch. In the left seat, the captain sat slumped forward, motionless. "Reyes, look out your left window," Callan said. He turned his head. Even through the chaos, even through the storm, she watched the moment relief hit him, like a physical blow. A sob broke loose in his voice. The kind men tried not to let strangers hear and failed to stop anyway. "I see you, Rook. Oh God, I see you." "All right," Callan said. "You're going to fly off my wing. I am your eyes, I am your instruments. You match my pitch, you match my role. We are going to walk this heavy girl down to the runway together. I can't hold her much longer, Major." The yoke's vibrating. "I think we're going to stall." "You will not stall," she said, and something in her voice made it true. "Push your throttles forward exactly half an inch. Lean on my lights." For the next 10 minutes, they flew a terrifying synchronized dance through a mountain range that wanted them both dead. Callan navigated by radar and instinct, flying close enough to see individual rivets on the Boeing's wing, close enough that a single wrong gust could turn 2 aircraft into one fireball. Every time Reyes drifted, she adjusted, blocking his path with her own airframe until he corrected. She was somewhere past exhaustion now, somewhere in a state of pure focus that only pilots who've stared death in the face understand. 50 miles out, the runway lights of Ironvale were within reach. They were going to make it. Then the alarm shrieked. Deedle, 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 deedle. Her threat warning indicator lit red. A yellow circle collapsed into a solid diamond on her HUD. She was being painted. Active targeting radar. Locked. And it wasn't coming from the ground. ANR command. Callan barked, the calm finally cracking in her voice. I have a hostile spike, fast mover, 6 o'clock. Who else is up here? Static. Then the ground controller's voice, frantic now, all pretense of composure gone. Rook 121, we see it. Just popped up on our scope. Unidentified bogey, high speed, closing. It is not one of ours. Repeat, it is not one of ours. Whoever had crippled Olympus 7 hadn't left. They'd been circling above the storm, patient, waiting to confirm the kill. And now that someone was interfering with their handiwork, they were coming back to finish the job properly. Major Reyes's voice cracked over the radio. What is that alarm? Are we locked? Callan's hands tightened on the stick. The ghost of Kestron whispered in her ear, the same voice that had told her to break formation 3 years ago and had cost her everything since. She was about to listen to it again. Reyes, listen to me, she said, her voice dropping into something flat and lethal. Keep heading 180. Do not deviate. I'm going to turn off my lights. You're going to lose visual on me. Wait, Rook. You can't leave me. I can't fly this thing alone. You can and you will. She flipped the master arm switch. Green lights turned red across her weapons panel. Keep flying, Reyes. I've got a pest control problem to take care of. She slammed the throttle to full afterburner, killed her exterior lights, and ripped her F-16 away from the crippled transport, diving into the black, violent heart of the storm to meet whoever was hunting them. The darkness swallowed her whole. Inside the cockpit, the threat tone screamed a continuous, nerve-shredding note. The enemy radar had lost the lumbering transport and locked entirely onto her instead. Exactly what I wanted, she thought. Jaw clenched so tight it ached. She threw her jet into a brutal 7G barrel roll. Air crushed from her lungs and mashed the countermeasure release. Bursts of chaff exploded behind her, microscopic aluminum fibers blooming into a false wall on enemy radar. The lock tone died, replaced by the rhythmic pinging of a searching signal. Broken. For now. ANR command, give me a picture. What am I looking at? Rook 1-1. Bogey profile matches a heavy twin-engine fighter. No transponder. No IF. Moving fast. Descending to your altitude. Range 10 miles, nose hot. A heavy fighter. Thrust vectoring, most likely. Built to perform maneuvers that shouldn't be physically possible. Against a lightly armed aggressor jet in a blizzard, it was an apex predator hunting something half its size. Whoever was flying it wasn't rogue. They were sent. She checked her weapons. 2 air-to-air missiles. 500 rounds in the cannon. Against whatever the enemy was carrying, she was outgunned in every way that mattered. If she fought at range, she'd die. So she wasn't going to fight at range. Come down into the basement with me, she whispered, and dove for the mountains. The storm was most violent down there. A chaotic blender of downdrafts and blinding snow. But the granite would mask her signature. And if she was going to survive the next 10 minutes, she needed every advantage the terrain could give her. The ground proximity system barked its robotic warning. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. She ignored it. Leveled out 500 feet above the ridgeline, flying purely on instruments and the occasional violent flash of lightning that showed her exactly how close she was to dying against a wall of rock. Her infrared sensors spiked. 2 glowing orbs of afterburner exhaust pierced the churning snow above her. The enemy had followed her down, hunting for her heat signature the way she'd hunted the transport. She didn't hesitate, never hesitated. She reefed back on the stick, pulling 8.5 punishing Gs. Her G-suit crushed her legs and abdomen, fighting to keep blood in her brain. Her vision tunneled to gray. She fought the blackout and yanked her jet into a vertical climb straight toward the belly of the heavier fighter above her. The enemy pilot realized his mistake a fraction of a second too late. He tried to roll away. She was already inside his turn. The targeting reticle painted itself across her visor. She simply had to look at him to lock. Fox 2, she said, and squeezed the trigger. The missile screamed off the rail in a blinding white flash, carving a twisting path through the storm. But the pilot was good. He killed his afterburners, dumped a wall of flares, and the sky erupted in false suns. Her missile veered, chasing heat that wasn't real, and detonated harmlessly against the mountainside. One missile left. The enemy fighter snapped into an impossible flat spin, nose swinging directly toward her. Traces sliced past her canopy, close enough to hear over the wind. She threw herself into a violent corkscrew, jinking hard, running on fumes both literal and figurative. Then lightning struck the sky, and in that single frozen instant, she saw it. The enemy had bled too much speed in that maneuver. He was fighting the storm now, stalling in the downdrafts, momentarily helpless. She didn't waste her last missile. Too close, too risky. She switched to guns. Her pipper settled over the enemy cockpit. She held the trigger down. The cannon roared, a sound that lived in her bones long after it finished, rounds tearing across the enemy's wing and engine housing. Flame erupted from the damaged engine. The fighter snapped into an uncontrollable spin, plummeting into the darkness below, and moments later, a silent bloom of fire lit the side of a mountain before the snow swallowed it whole. Splash 1. Callan exhaled a breath she didn't remember holding. Reyes, she gasped, banking back toward the south, her flight suit soaked through with cold sweat. Olympus 7, do you read? 3 agonizing seconds of static, then his voice, weaker now. I'm here, Rook, but I'm losing her. Hydraulic pressure is gone. I can't keep the nose up. I'm on my way, she said. Hold on. We're going home. The storm over Iron Vale showed no mercy as she located the wounded transport again, wallowing badly in the crosswinds like something dying slowly. She slid her jet close, using her landing lights to illuminate his shattered cockpit. You're drifting 3 degrees off the glide slope, she said. Correct right. Gently. I'm losing hydraulics entirely, Major. His voice cracked with something close to panic. If a downdraft catches us, we're going to roll. You are not going to roll. Gear down, she ordered. Crank it manually if the bus is dead. An agonizing 10 seconds passed. Gear is down, he finally said. 3 green, copy that. Pull your power back to idle. Let her sink. We're 3 miles out. They flew that final stretch on trust and instinct alone. Proximity alarms, screaming continuously in her helmet. A warning that they were milliseconds from a mid-air collision that would end them both. She ignored the noise and focused entirely on being the steady point of light he needed to survive the next 90 seconds of his life. The runway strobes of Iron Vale finally flared through the swirling snow. You have the runway, Reyes. Flare. She yanked her stick back, banking away into the storm as the massive Boeing slammed down onto the concrete behind her. It wasn't a landing so much as a controlled plummet. The compromised wing sagged, scraped, sent a shower of orange sparks 100 feet into the freezing air. Tires blew with shotgun cracks. The aircraft skidded wildly down the runway, shedding burning rubber, and finally shrieked to a violent, shuddering halt, just yards from the overrun barrier. They had survived. Callan circled the base, dumped her fuel to a safe weight, and brought her own jet down on the parallel strip. By the time she taxied into the hangar and cut the engine, the adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. Her hands shook so hard, she struggled to unlatch her harness. O'Malley was already waiting at the ladder. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the scorched, empty missile rail on her wing, then reached up and grabbed her arm to steady her as she climbed down on legs that didn't want to hold her weight. Get me a rover, she said, voice ragged. Minutes later, she stepped out of a military jeep near the crash site. The blizzard still raged, but emergency floodlights had turned the night into stark, artificial day. Fire crews smothered the smoking wing in retardant foam. Armed security had already thrown a tight perimeter around the wreckage. She bypassed the barricades, flashed her ID at a guard too stunned to stop her, and moved toward the triage tents where medics worked on the survivors near the emergency slides. She found Reyes sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, oxygen mask pressed to his face. Soot and blood streaked across his skin. When he saw her flight suit, he lowered the mask and gave her a slow, trembling nod. Gratitude too large for words. She returned it. Then a commotion near the tents pulled her attention away. 4 black armored SUVs breached the tarmac perimeter. Secret Service agents poured out, forming a tight diamond around a senior official being escorted by base doctors. Silver hair plastered to his forehead, a torn charcoal suit, his left arm immobilized in a makeshift sling. Despite the injuries, he walked with rigid, unmistakable authority, the kind that didn't bend even under the weight of a near-death experience. Callan froze. The wind seemed to stop entirely. It was Colonel Marcus Holloway, the architect of her ruin. The man who had stripped her combat status and exiled her to the edge of the world for daring to disobey him in Kestron 3 years ago. Holloway stopped dead when he saw her. The agents around him reached for their earpieces. He raised a hand, silencing them without looking away from her. He stepped forward. His eyes dropped to the name tape stitched across her chest. Ashford, C. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound between them was the howling wind and the diesel rumble of the fire engines. Base Command told me the aggressor pilot who guided us intercepted a hostile contact, he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. They didn't tell me it was you. Callan locked her knees, standing at rigid attention despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. She looked directly at the man who had tried to erase her. The airspace was hot, Colonel, she said, her voice eerily calm, echoing, word for word, the exact justification he had used to condemn her 3 years earlier. But someone had to hold the line. Holloway swallowed hard. His gaze drifted past her, toward the shattered wreckage of Olympus 7, glowing under the floodlights. If she had followed protocol tonight, if she had refused to engage that fighter without authorization, he would be ash, scattered across a mountain ridge right now, along with whatever classified purpose had put him on that flight in the first place. He stepped closer. Something in the rigid lines of his face finally softened. "You disobeyed standing protocol tonight, Major," he said quietly. "Yes, sir, I did." He extended his uninjured hand. She looked at it. Didn't take it. Not right away. Instead, she met his gaze, unflinching, and let him see exactly how little his gratitude was worth to her after 3 years of exile. Then he reached out and gripped her shoulder instead. "Thank God you did," he whispered. By the time the floodlights finally dimmed and the medics finished loading the last survivor into an ambulance, Callan was standing alone at the edge of the wreckage, watching snow settle over scorched metal, like the sky was trying to bury the evidence of what had happened here. That's when O'Malley found her. He didn't say anything for a while, just stood beside her, breath fogging in the freezing air, watching the same wreckage she was watching. Then he handed her something. A small evidence bag, the kind crash investigators used for debris, too small to matter to anyone except the people who'd know exactly what it meant. "Found this near the tail section," he said. "Figured you'd want to see it before it disappeared into somebody's report." Inside the bag was a fragment of avionics housing, scorched, twisted, but stamped faintly with a manufacturer's code she recognized instantly because she'd spent 6 months chasing paperwork trying to identify that exact same code. It matched her father's aircraft. The same equipment package, the same production batch, installed in a training aircraft that had gone down 8 years ago, in these same mountains, in a crash the Air Force had labeled undetermined and sealed before anyone thought to ask the right questions. Callan stared at the fragment until her hands stopped shaking, and then stared a little longer after that. Because coincidences didn't survive contact with the truth. Not usually. Not when the truth had teeth. O'Malley watched her face change, watched the exhausted relief of survival curdle into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. "You okay, Major?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Callan closed her fist around the evidence bag. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to find out." Behind her, the wreckage of Olympus 7 smoldered under the falling snow, keeping its secrets a little longer. Somewhere above the mountains, the storm was already beginning to clear, the way storms always do eventually, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and questions, and a woman who had never once, in her entire life, known how to leave a question unanswered. She looked north, toward the mountains, toward the place her father's aircraft had gone down 8 years ago, and the place, she now suspected, where somebody had been waiting all this time for her to finally come looking. Until tonight, She'd been asking questions and getting silence in return. Something told her that silence was about to end. The snow didn't stop for 3 days. Neither did Callan. She should have slept. Should have let the flight surgeon sign off on 72 hours of mandatory rest, the way regulations demanded after a confirmed air-to-air kill. Instead, she sat in the dim corner of the Ironvale Records annex at 2 in the morning. A single desk lamp burning against the dark. The evidence bag O'Malley had given her sitting on the table, like something radioactive. A scorched fragment of avionics housing, a manufacturer's code that matched her father's aircraft. 8 years of silence, and now this. One small piece of twisted metal that refused to make sense no matter how many times she turned it over in her hands. Because here's the thing about grief that nobody tells you. It doesn't heal in a straight line. It waits. It goes quiet for years at a time, convincing you it's finally done with you. And then one cold December night, it climbs back into the cockpit beside you and buckles in like it never left. She'd requested her father's accident file 11 times over 6 months. 11 denials, each one worded slightly differently, each one somehow managing to say nothing at all. Investigation concluded. File sealed pending review. Access restricted at this classification level. Except the investigation had concluded 8 years ago, which meant somebody was still actively keeping it sealed. Actively. Present tense. Which raised a question Callan had been chewing on for 6 months and had never quite let herself say out loud. Sealed from who? And why now? She typed the manufacturer's code into the records terminal one more time, watching the cursor blink against the black screen like it was daring her to give up. Access denied. Clearance insufficient. Same as always. Except this time she wasn't going to close the laptop and walk away. Because tonight she had something she hadn't had 6 months ago. A physical fragment. Proof that the same avionics package installed in her father's aircraft had somehow ended up embedded in the wreckage of a VIP transport that had just been shot out of the sky by an unmarked fighter jet. That wasn't a coincidence. Coincidences didn't have manufacturer codes. A knock at the door made her jump. Actual physical jump. The kind she hadn't allowed herself since Kestran. Since she'd trained her body to stop flinching at sudden sounds, because flinching got you killed in a cockpit. O'Malley leaned into the doorway, 2 coffees in hand, steam curling off both of them into the cold air of the annex. You didn't sleep, he said. Not a question, neither did you. Somebody's got to keep an eye on the crazy one, he said, setting a cup down beside her elbow. He glanced at the evidence bag. His jaw tightened. Find anything. Nothing the terminal wants to tell me. O'Malley pulled a chair over, the metal legs scraping loud against the floor in the empty room. He sat, studied her for a long moment with the particular patience of a man who'd spent 2 decades reading pilots better than they read themselves. You know I served with your dad, he said. Callan's head came up fast. She knew. Of course she knew. It was the reason she trusted O'Malley in the first place. The reason she'd let her guard down around him in a way she hadn't with anyone else at this base. But he'd never actually said the words out loud before. Not directly. Not like this. You never told me that. Wasn't relevant, he said, until it was. What changed? O'Malley's eyes flicked toward the evidence bag again. That code, he said. I've seen it before. Recognized it the second I pulled it out of the wreckage. That's not standard commercial avionics, Major. That's a classified navigation suite. Experimental. Ran maybe 200 units total before the program got shut down. Shut down when? 8 years ago. The coffee in Callan's hands had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. She set it down carefully. The way you set down something that might shatter if you weren't paying attention. The same year my father died. Same year, O'Malley confirmed. Same program. I was on the maintenance crew that installed it in his aircraft. 3 weeks before the crash. Something in Callan's chest went very still. The kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks open. Why didn't you tell me this 6 months ago? When I first started asking questions. Because 6 months ago you were asking questions, O'Malley said, his voice low and careful. Tonight you're holding evidence. Those are different things, Major. The first one gets you politely ignored. The second one gets you noticed by people who don't like being noticed back. Callan leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at him with an intensity that made even a man like O'Malley shift in his seat. "Then tell me everything," she said. "Right now, before somebody decides we shouldn't be having this conversation." O'Malley glanced at the door, checked it twice, an old habit from a career spent in places where walls occasionally had ears. Then he leaned in close and started talking. And for the next 20 minutes, Callan Ashford learned more about her father's death than she had in 8 years of asking the wrong people the right questions. The program was called Sentinel Compass, a next-generation navigation and targeting suite designed for deep penetration missions in contested airspace, classified above Callan's clearance even now 8 years after cancellation, which in itself told her something. Programs that got shut down for budget reasons didn't stay classified. Programs that got shut down because something went catastrophically wrong stayed classified forever. Her father had been one of the lead test pilots. 3 weeks into flight testing, an anomaly had appeared in the navigation data. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that should have grounded the program. But Colonel Everett Ashford had filed a formal report anyway, flagging what he called an unauthorized data channel embedded in the Sentinel Compass system. A backdoor. Something that was quietly transmitting flight telemetry to a receiver that wasn't on any approved list. 2 weeks after filing that report, he was dead. Training accident. Cause undetermined. Case closed. Callan sat frozen, staring at O'Malley across the desk lamp's small circle of light, feeling 8 years of assumed grief rearrange itself into something far more dangerous. "You're telling me my father found something he wasn't supposed to find," she said slowly. "And 2 weeks later he was dead. And you've known this the entire time I've been stationed here." "I suspected it," O'Malley corrected. "Suspicion and knowledge are different things too, Major. I didn't have proof. Just a bad feeling and a dead friend and a program that got buried so fast it left skid marks." "So, why tell me now?" "Because now you're not asking," he said, nodding at the evidence bag. "Now you're finding. And that fragment in that bag is the exact same navigation package that took down Olympus 7, which means whatever backdoor your father found 8 years ago, it's still active." The words landed like a physical blow. Still active. Which meant this wasn't ancient history. This wasn't a closed case gathering dust in a sealed file somewhere. This was a live wire, humming quietly under the surface of Ironvale for 8 straight years, waiting for someone to grab hold of it. Callan had just grabbed hold of it, because 2 nights ago, an unmarked fighter had used that exact same back door to hunt down a VIP transport in a blizzard, and the only reason it hadn't succeeded was because a disgraced aggressor pilot happened to be in the wrong airspace at exactly the right time. That wasn't luck. Except it had to be luck. Nothing else made sense. Unless. Callan's mind snagged on the thought and refused to let go of it. Unless somebody had known she'd be flying that route that night. Unless somebody had known a storm would ground every other asset within 300 miles, leaving her as the only possible interceptor. Unless the entire sequence of events, Olympus 7's flight plan, the timing of the attack, her own training rotation, had all been arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with coincidence. Which would mean somebody wanted her in that sky that night. Which would mean somebody had been watching her far longer than 6 months. She pushed the thought away. Too big. Too paranoid, even for a woman who'd just learned her father might have been murdered for asking the wrong question, one thing at a time. "Who else knows about Sentinel Compass?" she asked. O'Malley shook his head slowly. "That's the problem, Major. I don't know. The program was compartmentalized above my level even back then. I only know what I saw with my own hands, installing hardware I wasn't cleared to understand. If you want real answers, you need someone who actually worked the classified side of that program. Someone still alive. Still willing to talk. Do you have a name?" O'Malley hesitated. The hesitation itself told her everything. "There's one person," he said finally. "Civilian contractor. Worked propulsion systems integration for Sentinel Compass before it got shut down. Name's Dr. Naomi Foster. Lives about 40 miles south of here now. Retired, or in hiding, depending on who you ask. How do I find her?" "You don't," O'Malley said. "Not through official channels. Anyway, Anything that touches her name in a database is going to light up somewhere. If you want to talk to her, you go around the system entirely. Callan sat back, the weight of what he was suggesting settling over her slowly. You're talking about going outside the chain of command. I'm talking about survival, Major. Your father went through the chain of command, filed his report exactly the way regulations required. 2 weeks later, he was dead. You want to make a different choice. You need to make it a different way. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside rattled the annex windows, a low, mournful howl that felt, for the first time since Callan had arrived at this base, less like weather and more like a warning. Then she stood, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders. Get me a vehicle, she said. Off the books. Tonight. O'Malley studied her for a long beat, searching her face for any trace of hesitation. He didn't find one. He never did with her. Your funeral, Major, he said. Figuratively speaking, I hope. So do I. The drive south took 40 minutes through roads half buried in fresh snow. O'Malley's beat-up personal truck, fighting for traction the entire way. Callan sat in the passenger seat, the evidence bag tucked inside her jacket against her chest, watching the dark tree line blur past the window and trying not to think too hard about what she was about to walk into. Dr. Naomi Foster's cabin sat at the end of a road that technically didn't exist on any current map, tucked into a fold of the mountains where the trees grew close enough together to blot out most of the sky. A single light burned in one window. Smoke rose from a chimney into the freezing air. Somebody was home. Somebody was awake at 3 a.m. in a place specifically chosen to be hard to find. That alone told Callan something important. O'Malley cut the engine a quarter-mile out, and they walked the rest of the way on foot, boots crunching through snow that hadn't been disturbed by another vehicle in days. When they reached the cabin, Callan raised her hand to knock and found the door already opening before her knuckles made contact. A woman stood in the doorway. 60s, maybe? Silver hair pulled back tight. Eyes sharp enough to cut glass. The kind of eyes that had spent a career looking at things most people weren't allowed to see. She looked at Callan for a long moment, then at O'Malley, then back at Callan, and something shifted in her expression, some calculation completing itself behind those sharp eyes. You have his face, she said quietly. Everett's, around the eyes especially. Callan's breath caught. You knew my father. I worked with your father, Dr. Foster corrected, stepping back from the doorway to let them in. Different thing entirely, Major Ashford. Knowing someone implies they were allowed to tell you the truth about what they did all day. Nobody on that program was allowed to do that, not even to family. The cabin's interior was small, cluttered, warm in a way that felt deliberate, like Foster had built a fortress out of blankets and books and the particular clutter of a mind too sharp to ever fully rest. She gestured them toward a pair of chairs near the fire and disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later with 3 mugs of something hot that smelled like bitter herbs and old secrets. You've come about Sentinel Compass, she said, settling into a chair across from them. Not a question. I've been expecting someone to show up asking about it for 8 years. Didn't expect it to be his daughter. And I certainly didn't expect it to happen the same week Marcus Holloway's transport nearly went down in these exact mountains. Callan's pulse spiked. You know about Olympus 7. Everyone in this valley knows about Olympus 7, Major. The entire eastern sky lit up like the 4th of July 2 nights ago. Foster's eyes narrowed. What I want to know is what an aggressor pilot from Ironvale was doing, shooting down an unmarked fighter using the exact frequency range Sentinel Compass was designed to exploit. Callan reached into her jacket and set the evidence bag on the small table between them. I found this in the wreckage, she said. O'Malley recognized the manufacturer code, said it matched hardware installed in my father's aircraft 3 weeks before he died. Foster picked up the bag with hands that had gone very still. She studied the fragment inside for a long time, without speaking, turning it over once, twice, her expression unreadable in the firelight. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Quieter, older somehow, like the weight of the last 8 years had finally caught up to her all at once. Sentinel Compass was supposed to be a navigation breakthrough, she said. Precision guidance in denied environments. contested airspace. The kind of technology that saves pilots' lives when GPS gets jammed and every other system goes dark. That's what we told ourselves we were building. That's what half the team genuinely believed we were building. And the other half knew exactly what it really was, Foster said. A tracking system, disguised as navigation hardware. Every aircraft equipped with Sentinel compass was broadcasting its precise location to a receiver network that had nothing to do with official Air Force command channels. Your father found the back door during a routine data audit, filed a report, followed every regulation exactly the way he was supposed to. And 2 weeks later, he was dead. Callan finished, the words coming out flat and hollow. Foster nodded slowly. The program was shut down publicly within a month, she said. Officially due to budget overruns. Unofficially, because somebody very high up realized the back door had been discovered and needed the entire thing buried before anyone else started asking your father's questions. Who? Callan said. Who built the back door? Who was receiving that data? That, Foster said, is the question that got your father killed, Major. And I don't have a complete answer. What I have are fragments. Pieces I managed to preserve before they purged the program records. A shell company that funded a classified subcontract. Nobody in Air Force procurement ever officially authorized. A private security network that seemed to have far too much interest in a navigation upgrade program. She stood, crossed to an old filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the cabin, and returned with a thin folder, edges worn soft from years of handling. This is everything I managed to keep, she said, setting it in Callan's hands. I always hoped someone would come looking eventually. I just prayed it wouldn't cost them what it cost your father. Callan opened the folder with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside, faded printouts, financial records, heavily redacted but not completely, a shell company name that meant nothing to her yet, and near the bottom a single photograph that stopped her breath entirely. A group photo. A classified program team, standing in front of a hangar she didn't recognize. Her father, younger, smiling in a way she barely remembered him smiling. And standing 3 people to his left, unmistakable even 8 years younger, a man she'd stood face to face with just 2 nights ago on the Iron Vale tarmac. Marcus Holloway. Her chest went cold. He knew, she said quietly. He was there. He was part of this from the beginning. Foster's expression turned careful. Colonel Holloway was program oversight, she said. Whether that means he knew about the back door specifically, I genuinely don't know. Compartmentalization was strict even among leadership. But he was in that room, Major. He signed off on continued funding 2 weeks after your father's accident report was filed. Draw your own conclusions. Callan stared at the photograph until the fire crackling behind Foster became the only sound in the room. Marcus Holloway, the man she'd just risked her life to save. The man whose gratitude she'd stood there and accepted. The man who'd finally, after 3 years, looked at her like she mattered. And now this. Because that's the thing about the truth. It never arrives on a convenient schedule. It shows up exactly when you're finally ready to let your guard down, and it demands you tear the wound back open all over again. I need to talk to him, she said. Foster's hand landed on her arm, firm, urgent. If you confront him directly, and he's involved, you'll disappear the same way your father did, she said. If you confront him and he's not involved, you'll tip off whoever is that we're getting close. Either way, you need proof before you make that move. Not suspicion. Proof? Then help me get it. Foss studied her for a long moment. Somewhere behind those sharp, careful eyes, a decision was being made. There's a data cache, she said finally. Backup records from the final months of the program, before everything got purged. I hid it somewhere I thought I'd never need to retrieve. If it's still there, it should contain the complete list of everyone who had access to that back door. Names, dates, everything your father died trying to expose. Where? An old research annex, Foster said. Decommissioned facility about 60 miles northeast of here, deep in the mountains. It was part of the original Sentinel compass testing infrastructure before the program got shut down. Officially abandoned. Unofficially still monitored, if my old instincts are worth anything. Monitored by who? That, Foster said grimly, is exactly what we're about to find out. They left the cabin an hour before dawn, Foster insisting on coming along despite O'Malley's objections, arguing correctly that she was the only one who actually knew where inside the facility the cache was hidden. The drive northeast took nearly 2 hours, the roads growing progressively worse, the mountains closing in tighter around them until the truck was crawling along what barely qualified as a trail. The research annex, when they finally reached it, looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: abandoned, forgotten. A cluster of low concrete buildings half swallowed by drifted snow, chain link fencing sagging under years of neglect, warning signs faded almost to illegibility. Except the snow around the main entrance had been disturbed. Recently, footprints, already half filled by fresh snowfall, but unmistakably there, leading toward a service door that shouldn't have opened in 8 years. Callan's instincts went sharp and cold all at once. Somebody's already here, she said quietly. O'Malley's hand drifted toward the sidearm holstered beneath his jacket, a habit from a career that predated his maintenance crew. Years by a long stretch. Could be scavengers, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Could be nothing. Could be exactly what it looks like, Foster said grimly. Somebody watching this place, waiting to see if I'd ever come back for what I hid here. They approached carefully, staying low, using the ruined outbuildings for cover as they crossed the open ground toward the main structure. The service door hung slightly ajar, just enough to suggest recent use. Inside, the darkness swallowed the beam of Callan's flashlight almost entirely, the air thick with dust, and the particular stale cold of a building that hadn't been heated in nearly a decade. Foster led them through a maze of abandoned corridors, her memory of the layout still sharp despite the years, until they reached a maintenance room buried deep in the building's lower level. A section of wall panel, indistinguishable from any other, that Foster pried loose with practiced hands to reveal a small hidden cavity behind it. Empty. Foster's face went pale in the flashlight beam. "It's gone," she whispered. "It's been gone." Callan's flashlight swept the room, catching something the darkness had hidden until now. Fresh markings on the dusty floor. Boot prints, several sets, crossing and recrossing the small space in a pattern that suggested a thorough, professional search. "Somebody got here first," she said. "Recently." "How recently?" O'Malley asked, already moving toward the door, weapon drawn now without pretense. "The dust on these prints hasn't settled," Foster said. "Hours, maybe less." A sound cut through the silence. Distant, mechanical. The unmistakable thrum of rotor blades cutting through cold mountain air growing louder by the second. "Somebody's coming back," Callan said. They moved fast, retracing their path through the dark corridors toward the service entrance, Callan's mind racing through possibilities that all arrived at the same terrifying conclusion. Somebody had known about this cache. Somebody had retrieved it recently. And now somebody was returning to the site, likely to confirm it remained secure, which meant they were about to walk directly into the people who had killed her father. They reached the tree line just as a helicopter swept in low over the ridge, its searchlight cutting a brutal white swath across the snow, sweeping toward the annex with the precision of a team that had done this exact maneuver many times before. Down, Callan hissed, dragging Foster behind a fallen tree trunk as the light swept past overhead, close enough to feel the wash of rotor wind against her face. The helicopter circled once, twice, then settled onto a cleared section of ground near the main entrance. Figures dropped from the open door before it had even fully touched down, moving with the disciplined efficiency of trained operators, weapons up, sweeping the perimeter with practiced precision. Not scavengers, not local law enforcement. These were professionals. The kind of professionals who didn't officially exist, the kind whose equipment carried no unit markings, no insignia, nothing that could be traced back to any organization that would answer for their actions. Callan watched from the tree line, heart hammering, as one of the figures pulled off a tactical helmet and turned just enough for the helicopter's running lights to catch his face. Her breath stopped entirely. She recognized him. Not from Kestron. Not from anywhere in her military career at all. She recognized him from the Iron Veil command building. A civilian liaison who'd arrived at the base 6 months ago, officially attached to base intelligence coordination. Unofficially, someone she'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with total in that entire time. Daniel Kessler, the man who had personally briefed her training rotation schedule the week Olympus 7 went down. The pieces slammed together in her mind with a violence that nearly made her physically stagger. Kessler had known her flight schedule. Kessler had access to base operations, to storm predictions, to every piece of information necessary to engineer exactly the sequence of events that had put her in that specific patch of sky at exactly the moment Olympus 7 needed rescuing. Which meant the ambush hadn't been random. Which meant somebody had wanted her in that storm that night. Had wanted her to intercept that attack. Had wanted, for reasons she couldn't yet fully grasp, an aggressor pilot with a documented history of disobeying orders to be the one who shot down an unmarked fighter and personally witnessed proof of a conspiracy that had already killed her father. Why? Why would anyone want that? Unless the thought arrived cold and complete, and it terrified her more than anything else that had happened in the last 3 days combined. Unless she was never meant to survive the encounter. Unless the plan had assumed she would die in that dogfight, taking the truth about Sentinel Compass down with her, permanently silencing the one person still actively pulling at threads 8 years after her father had pulled at the same threads and paid for it with his life. And she'd survived anyway. Which meant whoever was behind this now had a serious unanticipated problem. We need to move, Foster whispered urgently, watching the tactical team spread out toward the annex entrance with clinical efficiency. If they find the cache is already gone, they'll widen their search radius. This tree line won't hold. O'Malley was already backing toward their vehicle, motioning them to follow, his instincts from a career Callan had never fully asked about, kicking into gear without hesitation. They retreated through the darkness, snow crunching beneath careful footsteps, the distant sound of the helicopter's idling rotors fading slowly behind them. Nobody spoke until they were back in the truck, engine running, tires finally finding solid road beneath the fresh snow. Callan sat in the passenger seat, hands clenched in her lap, staring out at the dark mountains sliding past the window. That was Kessler, she said finally. Daniel Kessler, Base Intelligence Liaison. He briefed my training rotation the week Olympus 7 went down. O'Malley's grip on the wheel tightened visibly. You're saying someone inside Iron Veil orchestrated the timing, he said slowly. Put you in that airspace specifically, on purpose. I'm saying I don't see how else it makes sense, Callan said. Foster's cache is gone. Recovered recently, probably right after Olympus 7 survived, when it wasn't supposed to. And the exact people retrieving it are led by a man with direct access to my flight schedule. Foster, silent in the back seat until now, finally spoke, her voice tight with something that sounded uncomfortably close to fear. If Kessler's involved, this goes deeper into the base than any of us wanted to believe, she said. Base intelligence liaisons don't operate independently, Major. They report through a chain, which means whoever's running this has access at a level high enough to place their own people directly inside Iron Veil's command structure. Which brings us back to Holloway, Callan said quietly. Not necessarily, Foster said, but it doesn't rule him out either. That photograph doesn't prove guilt. It proves proximity. There's a difference, and until we know which one applies to Colonel Holloway, confronting him directly is still the most dangerous move on the table. Callan closed her eyes, exhaustion and grief and fury tangling together into something that felt, for the first time in 3 years, dangerously close to overwhelming her completely. Then what do we do? She said. Because I can't just go back to Iron Veil and pretend I don't know any of this. I can't fly training rotations against Green Lieutenants, while the man who might have had my father killed sits 3 buildings away drinking coffee like nothing ever happened. You go back, exactly like nothing happened, O'Malley said firmly. Because the moment you tip your hand, Major, you become a liability they can't afford to leave breathing. Right now you're valuable. You're a hero who shot down an unmarked fighter and saved a colonel's life. That protects you. For now. For how long? Until they figure out what we know, Foster said grimly. Which, given tonight, might not be very long at all. The drive back to Ironvale passed in heavy silence, dawn beginning to bleed gray light across the eastern ridgeline as the base's perimeter fencing finally came into view. Callan stared at the familiar hangars, the flight line, the entire frozen little world she'd spent 3 years learning to survive inside, and felt it transform in front of her eyes into something far more dangerous than Exile. It had become a hunting ground, and she no longer knew, with any certainty, who exactly was hunting whom. 3 days passed in a strange, suffocating quiet. Callan flew her scheduled rotations, smiled at the appropriate moments. Let O'Malley's crew handle her pre-flight checks without commenting on anything unusual, even though she now studied every face on that flight line with a wariness she'd never needed before. She catalogued who watched her a little too closely, who found reasons to linger near her aircraft that didn't quite track. Kessler, she noticed, had made himself scarce entirely, absent from the command building for 3 straight days, according to the duty roster, officially attributed to a training liaison trip that nobody could quite confirm the destination of. That absence worried her more than his presence ever had. On the 4th night, a message arrived through a channel that shouldn't have existed. A slip of paper, tucked inside her locker at the squadron building, no signature, no explanation. Just 7 words and a set of coordinates that made her blood run cold the moment she recognized them. Your father found more than you know. The coordinates matched a location 12 miles northwest of Ironvale, deep in the Brooks Range. Almost exactly, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. The same general area where her father's aircraft had gone down 8 years earlier. Somebody wanted her out there. The question that kept her awake that entire night wasn't whether to go. It was whether whoever sent that note was trying to help her finish what her father started, or trying to finish what they'd started with him. She made the decision at 300 hours, the same hour she'd first heard Olympus 7's distress call 4 nights earlier, and found herself struck by the strange symmetry of it. Everything that mattered in her life, it seemed, happened in the deep, frozen hours before dawn, when the rest of the world was too exhausted to notice what was really going on. She didn't tell O'Malley, didn't tell Foster. This one, she needed to do alone, both because she couldn't risk anyone else walking into whatever waited at those coordinates, and because some deeply buried part of her understood that this particular reckoning, whatever it turned out to be, belonged to her and her father alone. She requisitioned a ground vehicle under a training exercise, designation, vague enough not to raise questions, and drove north into the mountains as the first hint of dawn began bruising the eastern sky purple. The coordinates led her to a narrow ravine she'd never noticed before. Despite 3 years of flying over this exact terrain, hidden behind a shoulder of rock that made it invisible from any standard approach vector, she parked, pulled on cold weather gear, and hiked the final half-mile on foot, her breath fogging thick in air, cold enough to hurt her lungs with every inhale. What she found at the end of that ravine stopped her cold. Wreckage. Old wreckage, weathered by 8 winters, half buried in snow and rock that had slowly, patiently swallowed the evidence over nearly a decade. But unmistakable, once she got close enough to see the tail markings, still faintly visible beneath layers of frost and corrosion. Her father's aircraft. The official crash site, according to every record she'd ever been shown, sat 40 miles east of here, a location she'd visited exactly once, 3 years ago, and stood at for exactly 11 minutes before the grief became too much to bear standing any longer. This wasn't that location. This was an entirely different site, hidden, deliberately hidden, judging by the terrain, tucked into a ravine that required specific knowledge to even locate, which meant the official crash site had been fabricated, which meant her father's aircraft had actually gone down here, and someone had spent considerable effort making sure nobody ever found this exact spot. Callan approached the wreckage with hands that had gone numb, and not entirely from the cold. The fuselage had crumpled on impact, torn open across the forward section in a pattern that looked, even after 8 years of weathering, disturbingly familiar. The same pattern she'd seen on Olympus 7 4 nights ago. Shrapnel scarring. A proximity detonation. Her father hadn't died in a training accident. Her father had been shot down. The exact same way somebody had tried to shoot down Olympus 7. The exact same method, the exact same signature, separated by 8 years, and connected by a navigation program that was supposed to have been shut down the entire time. She stood in that frozen ravine for a long time, snow gathering on her shoulders, staring at the wreckage of her father's final flight, feeling 8 years of assumed grief transform completely into something with an edge sharp enough to cut. Then she saw it, tucked into a crevice near what remained of the cockpit, protected from 8 winters of weather by an overhang of rock that had shielded it almost perfectly. A small, weathered case, military grade, the kind built to survive exactly the sort of impact that had destroyed everything around it. Her hands shook as she pried it free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the worst of the moisture out, a data drive. Small, unremarkable, and beside it, folded into quarters, a single handwritten page in handwriting she recognized instantly because she'd spent her entire childhood watching that exact handwriting fill logbooks and letters and birthday cards. Her father's handwriting. If you're reading this, it began, then you finally asked the right question. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from what I found. Everything is on this drive. Names, dates, the people who built the back door, and the people who ordered it built. Trust no one at Ironvale until you know exactly who they answer to. Especially him. The letter ended there, abruptly, like he'd run out of time to finish it. Especially him. No name. Nothing but 2 words and an unfinished sentence that would haunt her for the rest of her life if she never learned who he'd meant. Callan sank to her knees in the snow beside the wreckage of her father's aircraft, the drive clutched in both hands, and allowed herself, for the first time in 8 years, to grieve him completely and without restraint. Not the sanitized version of his death she'd been handed by official reports. The real one. A man who had found the truth, tried to do the right thing with it, and paid for that decision with his life, while his daughter spent nearly a decade believing it had simply been an accident. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Long enough for the sky to shift from purple to pale gray. Long enough for her knees to go numb through the cold weather gear. Long enough that when she finally heard the sound, distant at first, then closing fast, the mechanical thrum of rotor blades cutting through mountain air, she almost didn't react in time. The same sound from 4 nights ago. The same sound from 3 nights ago at the research annex. They'd found her. Callan shoved the data drive and the letter deep inside her jacket, scrambling up from the snow, mind racing through options that all narrowed down to the same brutal calculation. She was 12 miles from base, alone on foot, with a helicopter closing in that almost certainly carried people who'd already proven they were willing to kill to keep this exact secret buried. She had exactly one advantage. She knew this terrain better than almost anyone alive. 3 years of flying these mountains burned into her instincts in ways that no tactical team, however well trained, could match on the ground. She ran. Not toward her vehicle, parked in the open half a mile back, an obvious target for anyone approaching by air. Instead, she cut sideways into the tree line, following the natural fold of the ravine deeper into terrain too rugged for a helicopter to easily track a single moving figure against. The rotor sound grew louder behind her. Closer. A searchlight swept the ravine, catching the edge of the tree line just as she dove beneath the cover of low branches heavy with snow. Ashford, a voice called out over an external speaker, amplified and distorted but unmistakably calm in a way that made her blood run cold. "We know you're down there. This doesn't need to end badly." She didn't answer, didn't move, pressed herself flat against frozen ground, and controlled her breathing the way 3 years of survival training had taught her. Slow, shallow, invisible. "You found the wreckage," the voice continued. "That means you found what your father left behind. I understand the impulse to run with it. I genuinely do. But consider what happens to that data if you don't survive the next 20 minutes. Nothing. It disappears with you, exactly the way it should have disappeared 8 years ago. The searchlight swept closer, tree branches throwing stark, moving shadows across the snow around her. "Give us the drive," the voice said. "Walk out of these trees right now, and we discuss terms. You're valuable, Major. More valuable than you understand. This doesn't have to be the end of your story." Callan lay motionless, heart hammering against frozen ground, and made a decision that would define everything that came after. She wasn't walking out. She was going to survive this exactly the same way she'd survived every other impossible moment in her life, by refusing to accept the terms anyone else tried to set for her. The searchlight passed directly overhead, close enough that she felt the wash of rota wind through the branches above her, close enough to hold her breath entirely and pray the tree cover held. Long seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then gradually, the light moved on, sweeping deeper into the ravine, the sound of the rotors shifting direction as the search pattern widened away from her position. She waited until the sound had faded almost entirely, before she allowed herself to move again, and even then, she moved with a caution that bordered on paranoia, circling wide through the trees to approach her vehicle from an angle that kept the ridgeline between herself and the search pattern. By the time she finally reached Ironvale's perimeter, dawn had fully broken, pale winter light spilling across the flight line in a way that felt almost obscene given everything she now knew about the people who walked those same buildings every day. She drove straight to O'Malley's quarters, knocking with a hand that hadn't fully stopped shaking, and when he opened the door and saw her face, whatever he'd been about to say died instantly on his lips. "They found the site," she said, pushing past him into the room. "They shot down my father's aircraft 8 years ago. Same signature as Olympus 7, same method, and they just tried to do the exact same thing to me 12 miles from here." O'Malley's face went pale. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, "but I have this." She pulled the data drive from her jacket, setting it on the table between them, with hands that had finally started to steady. "Everything my father found," she said. "Names, dates, the people responsible. He hid it before they killed him, and I just spent the last 4 days walking directly into the same trap that got him killed, except this time I got out." O'Malley stared at the drive like it might detonate. "We need Foster," he said. "She'll have equipment that can access this, without leaving a trace on anything connected to base networks." Callan nodded, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once, the adrenaline that had carried her through the last several hours draining away and leaving something hollow and shaking in its place. "There's something else," she said quietly. "He left a message, told me not to trust anyone at Ironvale until I knew who they answered to. He said especially him. No name, just those 2 words." O'Malley was quiet for a long moment. "You think he meant Holloway?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Callan admitted. "I know Holloway was in that program photograph. I know he signed off on continued funding 2 weeks after my father's report. I know he showed up on that transport 4 nights ago, and I saved his life without knowing any of this. And now I don't know if I saved someone who deserved it, or someone who's been hiding exactly what my father died trying to expose." "There's one way to find out," O'Malley said grimly, nodding toward the drive on the table. "Let's see what's actually on there before we decide anything else." They drove to Foster's cabin through a morning that felt unnaturally bright after 4 days of storm and shadow, the mountains gleaming white and indifferent under a clear winter sun that seemed almost mocking given the weight of what Callan carried in her jacket pocket. Foster met them at the door with an expression that shifted from relief to grim anticipation the moment she saw the data drive in Callan's hand. It took nearly 2 hours to bypass the drive's encryption, Foster working with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent a career solving exactly this kind of problem. Callan pacing the small cabin's limited floor space with a restlessness she couldn't quite contain. When the files finally opened, nobody spoke for a long time. Financial records, communication logs, a complete accounting of who had funded the Sentinel Compass backdoor, who had authorized its continued operation, even after her father's report should have shut it down entirely, and who had ultimately ordered the actions that ended his life. A name appeared throughout the files with disturbing regularity. Not Holloway. A name Callan had heard exactly once before, standing in a snow-covered ravine 4 hours earlier, spoken through a helicopter's external speaker, with a calm that had chilled her to the bone. The voice that had tried to talk her out of the tree line. Cross-referenced against base personnel records, against communication logs, against a private security contract buried 3 layers deep in shell company paperwork. The name resolved into a face Callan had walked past dozens of times over the last 3 days without a second glance. Not Kessler, who turned out, according to the files, to be nothing more than an operator carrying out orders from somebody considerably higher up the chain. A name attached to Ironvale's intelligence division at a level of seniority that made Callan's stomach turn over completely. Colonel Patricia Vance, Base Intelligence Director. A woman Callan had saluted in hallways. A woman who had personally signed off on her aggressor rotation schedule every single week since she'd arrived at Ironvale 3 years ago. A woman with the exact access, the exact authority, and now, according to the files glowing on Foster's screen, the exact financial incentive to have orchestrated everything from her father's death 8 years ago to the ambush in the mountains this very morning. She's the one, Callan whispered, staring at the screen. She's been running this the entire time. From inside the base. From inside the chain of command I've been trusting for 3 years. Foster's expression had gone grim. There's more, she said quietly, scrolling further through the files. This isn't just about a backdoor navigation program anymore, Major. Look at the funding trail. Look at what she's been building with the money this network generates. Callan leaned forward, and what she saw on the screen made every previous revelation of the last 4 days feel suddenly terribly small by comparison. A private paramilitary network, operating under Vance's direction for years, funded through shell companies and classified black budgets never meant to intersect with each other, deployed for operations that had nothing to do with official military objectives and everything to do with protecting a secret worth killing for. And according to the most recent files, timestamped just 72 hours ago, a new operation already in motion. A target list. Names Callan recognized instantly, because one of them was her own, and near the top of that same list, flagged with a priority designation that made her blood run absolutely cold, a second name. Marcus Holloway. Not because he was complicit, because according to the files, he'd finally started asking questions of his own, in the days since Olympus 7 nearly killed him, questions that made him exactly as dangerous to Vance's network as Callan herself had become. Which meant the man she'd assumed was her enemy might actually be the one person inside Ironvale's command structure who could help her bring the entire network down. If she could reach him before Vance decided he'd become too dangerous to leave alive. Callan looked up from the screen, meeting O'Malley's eyes, then Foster's, feeling the shape of the next impossible decision settling over her shoulders like a weight she'd been training her entire career to carry. I have to warn him, she said. That's exactly what Vance will be expecting, Foster said carefully. If she's watching either of you, walking straight into Holloway's office, hands her everything she needs to move against both of you at once, then I won't walk in through the front door, Callan said, already moving toward the door, mind racing ahead to a plan that was still forming even as she spoke it aloud. But I'm not letting my father's death be the second name on that list. Not after everything it cost to finally learn the truth. Outside, the clear winter sky stretched wide and indifferent over the mountains, and somewhere within it, Callan knew, Colonel Patricia Vance was already moving pieces into place for whatever came next. The storm that had nearly killed her 4 nights ago had passed. But she understood now, standing in the doorway of a hidden cabin, with her father's final message burning in her jacket pocket, that the real storm had only just begun. Colonel Marcus Holloway's quarters sat in the officers' wing of Ironvale's command building, a section of the base Callan had never once had reason to enter in 3 years of exile, which made walking through its front door now in broad daylight, with a data drive containing evidence of conspiracy and murder tucked against her ribs, feel like stepping directly into the mouth of something that might close around her at any second. She didn't walk through the front door, because Foster was right. Because if Vance was watching either of them, the front door was exactly where that watching would be sharpest. So Callan did what she'd spent 3 years at Ironvale, learning to do better than almost anyone else on base. She found the way nobody was watching. O'Malley had a cousin who worked facilities maintenance, a steam tunnel system that ran beneath most of the administrative wing, original to a base built in the 1950s, and never fully decommissioned even as newer infrastructure got layered on top of it. Cold, cramped, smelling of rust and standing water, but invisible to every security camera that mattered. She emerged through a maintenance hatch, 2 doors down from Holloway's office, at 1,800 hours, snow melting off her boots onto polished government tile, heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Because this was the moment. This was the decision that either ended the entire nightmare or ended her. She knocked twice, waited, heard a chair scrape back inside, footsteps, the particular hesitation of a man who'd learned, in the last 4 days, to be suspicious of everything. The door opened. Holloway stood there in shirt sleeves, tie loosened, looking older than he had on the tarmac 4 nights ago, older and warier. His eyes found her face and something in them sharpened immediately. "Major Ashford," he said slowly. "This isn't a scheduled meeting." "No, sir," she said. "It isn't. Then what is it?" She didn't answer with words. She reached into her jacket and set the data drive in his palm, watching his expression as the weight of it registered, watching him understand, before she said a single sentence, that whatever she'd brought him was going to change everything. "That belonged to my father," she said. "Colonel Everett Ashford. He died 8 years ago flying a training mission over the Brooks Range. Except it wasn't training, and it wasn't an accident." Holloway's face went very still. "Close the door," he said quietly. She did. For the next 40 minutes, Callan told him everything. The manufacturer's code that matched Olympus 7's wreckage to a program that had officially ended 8 years ago. O'Malley's confession about installing the same hardware in her father's aircraft weeks before his death, the drive north to Foster's cabin, the hidden research annex already stripped clean by a tactical team, the ravine 12 miles from base, where her father's real crash site had been deliberately hidden from every official record, the helicopter that had hunted her through the trees that same morning, a voice over an external speaker, offering terms she'd refused to accept. And finally, the name the decrypted files had surfaced. Colonel Patricia Vance. Holloway listened without interrupting once, his face growing paler with every sentence, until by the time Callan finished he was sitting on the edge of his desk, the data drive clutched in one hand, staring at nothing. "I signed off on that program's continued funding," he said finally, his voice hollow. 2 weeks after your father's report. I didn't know what I was signing. Nobody explained the back door to me. I was oversight in name only, Major. A signature on a page somebody handed me during a briefing that lasted 11 minutes. "That's what Foster said," Callan replied. "Proximity isn't guilt. Except it feels exactly like guilt, doesn't it?" Holloway said, looking up at her with something raw in his expression she hadn't expected to see there. "Your father died 2 weeks after I put my name on a document that kept his killers funded. I don't need to have known the details to carry that." Callan said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would make that easier for him, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't particularly want to make it easier. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly how much of the last 8 years he actually deserved to carry. "There's more," she said instead. "Vance isn't just protecting an old secret. She's built something, a private network, funded through the same channels that built the back door, deployed for operations that have nothing to do with anything the Air Force actually authorizes." Holloway's jaw tightened. "And she's decided both of us are loose ends," he said. "Both of us," Callan confirmed. "You started asking your own questions after Olympus 7. That made you dangerous the same way I became dangerous the moment I started pulling this thread. The files flagged you 3 days ago. Priority designation. For a long moment, Holloway simply stared at the drive in his hand, and Callan watched something shift behind his eyes. Not fear, exactly, though there was plenty of that too. Something closer to resolve. The particular hardening that happens in a man who has spent an entire career believing in the chain of command, only to discover the chain itself has been quietly corrupted from somewhere near the top. "We can't fight this through official channels," he said slowly. "If Vance has this level of reach inside base intelligence, any formal report gets flagged before it clears her desk. We'd be dead before an investigation ever opened." "Then we don't go through channels," Callan said. "We go around them. The same way my father should have, if anyone had warned him what he was walking into." Holloway's eyes came up, sharp now, calculating in a way that reminded her, briefly and uncomfortably, of the man who'd once ordered her to hold her airspace, while 11 Marines died waiting for permission that would have arrived too late. "You're talking about moving against a sitting intelligence director," he said. "Without authorization. Without backup. That's not insubordination, Major. That's the kind of thing that ends with both of us in a military prison, if we're lucky enough to survive long enough to be arrested." "I know exactly what it is," Callan said. "I've done it before. It cost me my combat status and 3 years of my life, and I'd do it again tomorrow if it meant 11 people got to keep breathing. Because that's the thing you never understood about that night in Kestrin, Colonel. It was never about the order. It was about what happens to the people who trusted somebody in a position of authority to protect them, the foreign, and got left to die instead while that authority worried about paperwork." Holloway flinched. Actually flinched, the way a man flinches when a truth lands exactly where it was always going to land eventually. "I deserved that," he said quietly. "Yes," Callan said, "you did." He set the drive down on his desk, exhaled slowly, and when he looked back up at her, something had changed in his posture. Straighter, more decided. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." The plan they built over the next 2 hours was reckless, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so out loud, because saying it out loud would have made backing out one feel like the responsible choice. Vance's authority ran deep inside Iron Veil's official structure, deep enough that any conventional attempt to expose her would simply vanish inside the same bureaucratic machinery she'd spent years learning to manipulate. Which meant they needed something conventional channels couldn't bury. Public exposure, enough witnesses, enough simultaneous confirmation that no single office could quietly make the problem disappear before morning. Holloway had a contact. A civilian journalist embedded with a defense oversight committee, someone he'd worked with years earlier on an unrelated matter, someone whose credibility couldn't be dismissed as easily as a disgraced aggressor pilot with a documented history of insubordination. Callan had O'Malley and Foster and a data drive containing 8 years of buried evidence. What neither of them had, and what they both knew they desperately needed, was proof that Vance's network were actively operational right now. Not 8 years ago. Not 4 nights ago. Tonight. Something happening in real time that would make the entire conspiracy impossible to dismiss as ancient history. "We need her moving," Holloway said, pacing the small confines of his office as the evening outside deepened toward full dark. "On record. Doing something that can't be explained away as routine base security. Then we give her a reason to move," Callan said. Holloway stopped pacing. "What are you thinking?" "She's already trying to eliminate 2 loose ends," Callan said slowly, the shape of the idea forming even as she spoke it. "Us. She doesn't know we've already connected the dots this far. If she thinks we're about to expose her tonight, she'll have to act fast, which means mobilizing whatever assets she has on base in a way that gets noticed." "You're proposing we bait her," Holloway said. "I'm proposing we finish what my father started," Callan said. "Except this time we make sure it doesn't end the same way." At 2,100 hours, a carefully constructed message went out through a communication channel. Holloway confirmed Vance's network had compromised weeks earlier, a channel neither of them had any legitimate reason to use except that its very insecurity made it perfect bait. a message indicating that Major Callan Ashford and Colonel Marcus Holloway intended to present evidence of the Sentinel Compass conspiracy directly to a visiting oversight committee arriving at Iron Vale the following morning. It wasn't entirely a lie. The oversight committee was real, scheduled for an unrelated routine inspection that happened, by pure administrative coincidence, to land at exactly the right moment. Vance didn't know that part. All Vance would see was a closing window, a threat about to become irreversible, which meant, if Holloway's understanding of her character held true, she would move tonight to eliminate that threat before morning made it permanent. They didn't have to wait long. At 2,247 hours, O'Malley's radio crackled with a report that made Callan's blood run cold, even though she'd been expecting exactly this. Unauthorized personnel movement near the flight line. Security detail reassigned that hadn't gone through standard command channels. Someone with intelligence division authority quietly repositioning armed personnel around specific buildings. Callan's quarters, Holloway's office, the maintenance annex, where O'Malley had been keeping the original evidence bag secured. She's moving, O'Malley said grimly, meeting Callan and Holloway in the shadow of an unused hangar at the edge of the flight line, the rendezvous point they'd agreed on an hour earlier. Personal security detail, 6 men. Converging on your quarters right now, Major. Callan felt something settle inside her chest. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the calm that had carried her through the storm 4 nights ago. The particular stillness that arrived whenever the moment finally demanded everything she had. Then it's time, she said. Foster's voice crackled through a secure comm unit O'Malley had rigged that afternoon, patched in from the cabin 40 miles south, where she'd remained to monitor the compromised communication channel for exactly this kind of movement. I'm seeing additional traffic, she said, urgency sharpening her normally measured voice. Vance just authorized access to the base armory. That's not a security detail anymore, Major. That's a strike team. Holloway's jaw tightened. She's not planning to arrest us, he said quietly. She's planning to eliminate us and stage it as something else entirely. A training accident. A security incident gone wrong. Something that closes the file permanently before that oversight committee ever lands. Which is exactly the mistake we needed her to make, Callan said, though her voice carried less confidence than the words themselves suggested. Foster, are you recording this traffic? Every byte, Foster confirmed. Time-stamped, authenticated, impossible to deny once it surfaces. But Major, recorded evidence doesn't stop 6 armed men who are 3 minutes from your quarters right now. Callan looked at Holloway, at O'Malley, at the flight line, stretching out into darkness beyond the hangar, familiar in a way that felt, in this exact moment, like the only solid ground left in a world that had spent 4 days collapsing beneath her feet, one revelation at a time. Then we don't let them get to my quarters, she said. We change the battlefield. What did you have in mind, O'Malley asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer and didn't love it. Callan's eyes moved toward the hangar behind them, toward the dark silhouette of an F-16 sitting fueled and ready on standby alert, the same aircraft she'd have been assigned if tonight's rotation had proceeded normally instead of dissolving into exactly this. I take the sky, she said. She won't risk an open confrontation with 6 men against a decorated combat pilot in the open air, not with a recording running and an oversight committee 12 hours out. She'll have to come to me directly, which means she has to expose herself. That's insane, Holloway said flatly. It's the only move that doesn't end with all 3 of us dead in a staged accident by midnight, Callan said. You have a different plan, Colonel. I'm listening. He didn't have a different plan. Nobody in that hangar had a different plan, and they all knew it, and the silence that followed carried the particular weight of people accepting a terrible idea because every alternative was worse. Foster, Callan said into the comm unit, patch me directly into base command frequency. If Vance is running this personally, I want her to hear exactly what I know, in real time, with witnesses listening on the other end of that channel. You want to broadcast this, Foster said, openly. I want to make it impossible for her to bury, Callan said. My father tried to do this quietly, through the proper channels, and it got him killed without anyone ever knowing why. I'm done being quiet. 3 minutes later, Callan sat in the cockpit of the F-16, engine spinning up, the familiar weight of her helmet settling against her skull like an old, trusted friend returning after too long an absence. O'Malley worked the ground crew checks with the speed of a man who understood exactly how little time they had, his hands moving fast and sure, despite everything. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, pausing at the base of the ladder before she sealed the canopy. "I'm not alone," she said. "I've got Foster on comms, Holloway running interference with command, and you making sure this aircraft doesn't fall out of the sky because of a maintenance oversight. That's not alone, Chief. That's a team." O'Malley managed something that was almost a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Bring her back in one piece, Major," he said. "I've buried enough Ashfords for one lifetime." The canopy sealed, the engine roared to full power, and Callan Ashford taxied out onto a runway she'd flown 100 times before, into a sky that had already tried to kill her once this week, carrying inside her jacket the last piece of evidence her father had died protecting. She was airborne within 4 minutes, climbing hard into a clear night sky scattered with stars that felt, after days of storm and shadow, almost obscenely peaceful. Iron Vale's runway lights fell away beneath her, the base sprawling out in familiar grids of orange sodium light, and somewhere down there in that grid, she knew, Colonel Patricia Vance was discovering that her strike team had arrived at an empty apartment. Foster's voice crackled through her headset. "Command frequency is open, Major. You're patched in. Anything you say now, every duty officer on this base is going to hear." "Good," Callan said. "Let them hear it." She keyed her radio, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, given everything her body was doing beneath the calm surface she'd learned to project during the worst moments of her career. "This is Major Callan Ashford, broadcasting on base command frequency. 8 years ago, Colonel Everett Ashford discovered a classified backdoor embedded in the Sentinel Compass navigation program. He filed a report through proper channels. 2 weeks later, he was killed, and his death was falsified as a training accident to cover the truth. 4 nights ago, the same backdoor was used to bring down a VIP transport carrying Colonel Marcus Holloway. Tonight, 6 armed personnel were dispatched to eliminate myself and Colonel Holloway before we could present evidence of this conspiracy to a federal oversight committee arriving tomorrow morning. That evidence is already secured, time-stamped, and beyond anyone's reach. The individual responsible for authorizing tonight's action is Colonel Patricia Vance, Base Intelligence Director. Static answered her for 3 long seconds. Then a new voice cut through the channel, cold and precise, carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent a career learning exactly how to sound in control, even when control was slipping through her fingers in real time. "Major Ashford, this is Colonel Vance. You are broadcasting classified allegations on an open frequency, which is itself a serious violation. I strongly suggest you land your aircraft immediately and report to base security for a full debrief before this situation escalates further than either of us wants." Callan almost laughed. Almost. The absurdity of it, the sheer nerve, would have been impressive under any other circumstances. "I'll land," she said, "when there's an actual investigation with actual oversight, and not 6 armed men waiting to make sure I never get the chance to testify." "There is no conspiracy," Vance said, her voice tightening almost imperceptibly. "There is a decorated but troubled officer, suffering the psychological aftermath of a documented combat trauma history, making increasingly erratic and unfounded accusations against her chain of command. I'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, Major, but you're leaving me no choice, except to formally recommend a psychiatric evaluation and immediate grounding." "That's a good line," Callan said. "You should have used it 8 years ago. Might have worked better on a dead man than it's going to work on someone who's still breathing and has the data to prove every word." The silence that followed carried weight, the particular silence of a woman recalculating in real time, and Callan felt something shift in the balance of the conversation. Not victory, not yet, but something. Then Vance spoke again. and this time her voice had changed entirely. Quieter, colder, stripped of the performance she'd been running for the benefit of whoever else was listening on that frequency. "You have no idea what you've actually stumbled into, Major," she said. Sentinel Compass was never about tracking aircraft. It was about protecting this country from threats. Your rank doesn't clear you to understand. Your father found half a truth and mistook it for the whole picture. You're making exactly the same mistake, and you're about to pay exactly the same price he did. "Then, explain the whole picture," Callan said. "Right now, on this frequency, with witnesses, since you're so confident I've got it wrong." "I don't answer to a grounded aggressor pilot," Vance said. "I answer to people considerably above both our pay grades, and those people have already decided what happens next. Land your aircraft, Major. This is your last opportunity to make that choice yourself." The radio went silent, and 30 seconds later, Callan's threat warning system began to chirp, a soft, insistent tone entirely different from the shrieking alarm that had torn through her cockpit 4 nights ago, but unmistakable all the same. Somebody had just locked a radar onto her aircraft. "Foster," she said, forcing her voice to stay level despite the sudden spike of adrenaline flooding her system. "I've got a lock. Confirm what I'm looking at." "Working on it," Foster said, and Callan could hear the fear breaking through her usually composed voice. "Major, this is coming from a ground-based system, not airborne. Vance has access to Ironvale's own air defense network. She's willing to shoot down her own base's asset," Callan said, disbelief and grim understanding colliding in her voice. "In front of an open channel, with witnesses." "She's not thinking about witnesses anymore," Foster said. "She's thinking about survival. And right now, you're the single biggest threat to hers." Callan's mind raced, calculating options the way she'd calculated options 100 times before in situations that should have killed her, and somehow hadn't. She was flying an unarmed aircraft, this time. No missiles loaded for a routine standby alert, no weapon systems that could turn this into anything except pure evasion. Which meant her only advantage was the same advantage she'd always had. Her instincts. Her willingness to do the thing nobody expected. She threw the F-16 into a hard diving turn, breaking away from the base's primary radar coverage zone, dropping altitude fast toward the same mountain terrain that had saved her life 4 nights ago. The threat tone wavered, lost its lock, found it again, wavered once more as she jinked through a canyon too narrow for the base's fixed radar installation to track cleanly. "Command, this is Ashford," she called out, breathless now, fighting the stick through violent evasive maneuvers that strained every muscle in her body. Vance just activated a ground-based weapons lock against a friendly asset over Ironvale airspace. If that's not proof enough for whoever's still listening on this frequency, I don't know what would be. A new voice cut through the static, young, uncertain, but present and listening, and apparently unwilling to stay silent any longer. "This is Duty Officer Reyes," the voice said, and Callan's breath caught at the name, at the sudden realization that the first officer she'd guided through the storm 4 nights ago was somewhere down there right now, monitoring exactly the channel she needed monitored. "I have independent confirmation of the weapons lock on radar. Colonel Vance, I'm requesting you stand down that system immediately, or I'm escalating this to base commander regardless of your authorization level." "You don't have the clearance to countermand my orders," Vance snapped, her composure fracturing further with every passing second. "I have the clearance to refuse to participate in shooting down a decorated officer over an open channel while an oversight committee is inbound in 10 hours. Reyes shot back, and Callan felt something loosen in her chest. At the sound of it, at the sound of one more person deciding, in real time, that silence wasn't survivable anymore either. The threat lock wavered again, held, then abruptly, dropped entirely, the tone in Callan's headset falling silent for the first time in nearly 2 minutes. "She's lost the radar track," Foster confirmed, relief flooding her voice. "Major, I think Reyes just physically shut down the targeting system from the command center. You're clear." Callan leveled her aircraft out, breathing hard, hands trembling slightly against the stick, despite 3 years of training designed to eliminate exactly that response. "Command, this is Ashford," she said, forcing steadiness back into her voice. "Requesting permission to land. I believe we have enough on record now to close this out properly." The response, when it came, wasn't Vance's voice. It was Holloway's. "Permission granted, Major," he said, and something in his tone told her the ground situation had shifted decisively while she'd been fighting for her life in the sky above it. "Colonel Vance has been detained by base security, acting on Duty Officer Reyes's authority and the recorded evidence of tonight's weapons activation. Come home." She brought the F-16 down onto Iron Vale's runway 11 minutes later, the same runway she'd landed on countless times over 3 years of exile, except this time the exile was ending. This time, she was landing into something that felt, for the first time since Kestran, almost entirely like vindication. The flight line was full when she taxied into the hangar. O'Malley, Foster, driven in from her cabin, the moment the confrontation ended. Holloway standing at the edge of the crowd with an expression she couldn't quite read, and near the center of it all, under harsh floodlights and flanked by base security personnel who'd clearly made their own decision about which side of this story they wanted to stand on. Colonel Patricia Vance, handcuffed, silent, her face a mask of cold fury that had finally, entirely, run out of places to hide. Callan climbed down from the cockpit on legs that barely held her weight, adrenaline crash, hitting exactly as hard as it had 4 nights earlier, and found O'Malley already there to catch her the way he always seemed to be. "It's over," he said quietly. "Not quite," she said, though exhaustion made the words come out softer than she intended. "There's still an oversight committee that needs the full story tomorrow morning. There's still 8 years of buried records that need to see daylight properly. And there's still a lot of names on that shell company paperwork we haven't fully traced yet. But tonight," O'Malley said, firm and certain, "tonight it's over, Major. Your father's name is clear. That's what tonight was actually about, if you strip away everything else." Callan looked past him, toward Vance, standing motionless under the floodlights, and felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something closer to the particular ache of finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. The Oversight Committee arrived the following morning, precisely on schedule, and what should have been a routine Pete's inspection transformed instead into the opening session of an investigation that would eventually reach considerably higher than Colonel Patricia Vance's office. Foster's preserved records, combined with the data drive recovered from her father's crash site and the recorded confirmation of a weapons lock activated against a friendly aircraft on an open channel, proved more than sufficient to launch a formal inquiry that no amount of institutional protection could quietly bury. Vance, facing charges that would eventually include conspiracy, obstruction, and complicity in the deaths of multiple military personnel across nearly a decade, offered exactly one piece of cooperation in exchange for reduced charges: a partial accounting of who above her had originally authorized the Sentinel Compass backdoor and ordered its protection maintained at any cost. The names that surfaced went higher than Iron Vale, higher than the Air Force's regional command structure entirely, into corners of the defense establishment that would take years, Callan understood, to fully untangle, and that understanding settled over her with a weight that felt less like an ending and more like the opening chapter of something considerably larger than she'd ever intended to uncover. But that story belonged to the Oversight Committee now, to federal investigators, to people with resources and authority far beyond what a single aggressor pilot exiled to the edge of Alaska could ever hope to command alone. Her part, the part that mattered most, the part her father had died trying to complete, was finished. 3 weeks later, on a morning cold enough to make breath crystallize instantly in the air, but calm in a way Iron Vale rarely offered, Callan stood at the edge of a small military cemetery 40 miles south of the base, snow crunching beneath boots that had walked this exact path exactly once before, 3 years ago, for exactly 11 minutes. This time she didn't rush. Her father's headstone read Colonel Everett James Ashford, and beneath it, the dates that bracketed a life she was only now beginning to fully understand. She'd requested, and finally received, official correction of his service record. Killed in the line of duty, the new documentation read, in connection with the unauthorized suppression of classified intelligence findings. Not the sanitized fiction of a training accident that had stood unchallenged for 8 long years. It wasn't everything. It couldn't undo 8 years of grief built on a lie, couldn't give her back the version of her father's death she'd have chosen, if choosing had ever been an option. But it was true. And after everything, after Kestron and Ironvale, and a blizzard that had nearly killed her twice in 1 week, Callan had come to understand that true mattered more than almost anything else the world could offer her. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She'd have recognized that particular unhurried gait anywhere by now. O'Malley stopped beside her, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, breath fogging in the cold morning air. "Command wants to reinstate your combat status," he said without preamble, the particular bluntness she'd come to rely on over 3 long years. "Full restoration. Squadron command track, if you want it." Holloway's pushing it through personally. Callan kept her eyes on the headstone. "And if I don't want it," she said. "Then you don't want it," O'Malley said simply. "Nobody's going to make you choose anything ever again, Major. That's sort of the whole point of everything you just survived." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. I don't know yet," she said honestly. "What I want, that's allowed too," O'Malley said. "Take your time deciding." They stood together in silence. For a while, the wind moving quietly through the cemetery's rows of identical white headstones, each one representing a story nobody outside a handful of grieving families would ever fully know. Callan thought about her father, 28 years old once himself, flying missions in skies she could only imagine, believing the same things she'd once believed about duty and chain of command, and the people entrusted to protect the truth on behalf of everyone who couldn't protect it themselves. He'd been wrong about some of those people, but he hadn't been wrong to believe the truth mattered enough to die protecting it. "I think," she said slowly, working the thought out loud for the first time, "that I want to keep flying, but not the way I used to. Not proving something to people who already decided what they think of me before I ever climb into a cockpit." "Then what?" O'Malley asked. "Flying because it's mine," she said. "Because I earned it. Because nobody gets to take that away from me twice." O'Malley nodded slowly, something that might have been pride settling into the weathered lines of his face. "Your father would have liked that answer," he said quietly. Callan finally looked away from the headstone, toward the mountains, rising pale and distant against a clear winter sky. The same mountains that had swallowed her father's secret for 8 long years, and had very nearly swallowed her too. "I hope so," she said. They walked back toward the vehicle together, snow crunching beneath their boots, and behind them, the cemetery settled back into its permanent, patient quiet. One more story finally told in full after years of silence. One more name restored to the truth it had always deserved. Somewhere above the mountains, a distant contrail cut a clean white line across the pale blue sky. Another pilot flying, another mission in skies that would keep demanding, generation after generation, the exact same impossible courage Everett Ashford had shown 8 years ago, and his daughter had shown 3 years after that, and would likely be asked to show again before her own story finally reached its end. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Callan Ashford simply stood in the cold morning air and breathed, unburdened, finally, by a secret that had never belonged to her alone to carry. The sky above Ironvale, for once, held nothing but clear, quiet blue. 6 months. That's how long it took for Ironvale to stop feeling like a crime scene and start feeling like something closer to home. Because that's what trauma does to a place if you let it. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits underneath everything, quiet, patient, waiting for you to walk past the same hangar or the same stretch of tarmac and remember exactly what happened there. Callan had spent the first month after Vance's arrest flinching every time a helicopter passed overhead, the second month jumping at radio static. By month 3, the flinching had mostly stopped. Mostly. Until the day a black SUV rolled through the front gate unannounced, and every muscle in her body remembered exactly how to go cold in under 2 seconds. She was standing on the flight line when it happened, clipboard in hand, halfway through signing off on a maintenance report she genuinely didn't care about, and the sight of that vehicle sent her right back to a snowy tarmac and a man with silver hair and a torn charcoal suit. Except this time, the man who climbed out wasn't wearing a torn suit. He was wearing a grin. "Relax," Marcus Holloway called out across the tarmac, hands raised in mock surrender. "I come in peace, Major. Or should I say, Lieutenant Colonel?" Callan's clipboard nearly slipped out of her hands. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking," Holloway said, closer now, still grinning like a man who'd been waiting weeks to deliver this particular piece of news in person. "Came through this morning. Official. Signed by people considerably above my pay grade, which, trust me, is saying something these days." For a moment, Callan just stood there, feeling the cold Alaskan wind cut across the tarmac, feeling 6 months of grief and fury and vindication rearrange themselves one more time into something that felt suspiciously, dangerously close to joy. Because promotion had never been the point. Not really. The point had always been the truth. But standing there, hearing it confirmed out loud, she understood that sometimes the universe let you have both. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say thank you," Holloway said, "and then say yes to the actual reason I flew all the way up here myself, instead of letting a courier deliver the paperwork. There's a catch." "There's always a catch with you people," she said, but there was no real bite in it anymore. "Not after everything." Holloway's grin faded into something more serious. "The Oversight Committee wants a permanent liaison position," he said. "Someone who understands both sides of this, the chain of command, and what happens when that chain gets compromised from the inside. Someone credible enough that when they speak, people actually listen, instead of writing it off as institutional damage control." "Let me guess," Callan said. "You're not talking about yourself." "I'm past my usefulness for that particular kind of credibility," Holloway said dryly. "Turns out nobody trusts the guy who signed the funding paperwork, even when he genuinely didn't know what he was signing. But you, Colonel Ashford, you're the daughter of the man who died trying to expose this. You're the officer who nearly died twice trying to finish what he started. Nobody questions your motives." Callan stared out across the flight line, at the mountains rising pale and endless in the distance, at the same sky that had tried to kill her twice in 1 week and had somehow, eventually, given her back everything that mattered. "It would mean leaving Ironvale," she said quietly. Not a question exactly, just the shape of the decision settling into place. "It would mean leaving Ironvale," Holloway confirmed. She thought about O'Malley, about the flight line crews who'd trusted her before anyone in command bothered to. About 3 years of exile that had somehow, impossibly, turned into the only place she'd ever really belonged. "Give me a week," she said. "Take 2, Holloway said. "Some decisions deserve the extra time." He turned to walk back toward his vehicle, then paused, glancing back at her with an expression that had softened considerably since the last time they'd stood on this exact stretch of tarmac. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. "I know that's not really mine to say, but somebody should say it, and I figured I owed him at least that much." Callan watched the SUV pull away through the front gate, snow swirling in its wake, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without a single sharp thing to say in response. She found O'Malley in the hangar an hour later, elbow deep in an engine panel that didn't strictly need his personal attention anymore. Not with 3 junior crew chiefs perfectly capable of handling routine maintenance now that Ironvale's flight operations had returned to something resembling normal. He looked up when she approached, read something in her face, before she'd said a single word, and set down his wrench with the particular resignation of a man who'd spent 2 decades learning to recognize the exact moment somebody's life was about to change. "Holloway offered you something," he said. "Not a question." "A liaison position," she said. "Oversight Committee. Permanent. You going to take it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "It would mean leaving here." O'Malley wiped his hands on a rag considering her for a long moment with the kind of patience that had made him, over 3 years, the closest thing to family Callan had left in the world. "Can I tell you something, Major?" he said. "Colonel, whatever we're calling you these days, always. Your father used to say, the sky doesn't care what rank is stitched on your shoulder," O'Malley said. "Doesn't care what building you report to in the morning. All it cares about is whether you show up and do the work honestly, wherever that work happens to be." He believed that until the day he died. Maybe especially on the day he died. Callan felt something tighten in her throat. "You think I should take it?" "I think you should stop asking me what you should do," O'Malley said, not unkindly. "You've spent 3 years proving you don't need anyone's permission to make the right call. Don't start needing it now, just because the decision finally doesn't involve somebody trying to kill you." She laughed, actually laughed, surprised by the sound of it after months, where laughter had felt like something that belonged to other people. "I'm going to miss you, Chief," she said. "If I take it, I'm not going anywhere," O'Malley said. "Somebody's got to keep training the next generation of hotshots who think they know everything. Besides, Alaska's not exactly hard to find, if you ever need somebody to tell you the truth when everybody else is too polite." That evening, Callan drove into the small town that had grown up along Ironvale's southern perimeter over the decades, a scattering of diners and gas stations, and one particular coffee shop that had, somehow, over the last 6 months, become the closest thing she had to a routine that didn't involve conspiracy or grief. Daniel Reyes was already there when she walked in, 2 coffees on the table in front of him, exactly the way he'd started doing 3 months ago, without either of them ever quite discussing why. He'd left active flight status after Olympus 7, physically capable of flying again, eventually, but something in him had shifted that night in the storm, some fundamental recalibration of what he wanted his life to look like going forward. He'd transferred to Ironvale's training command instead, teaching young pilots the exact kind of calm, steady radio discipline that had kept him alive during the worst night of his life. "You look like someone who just got handed a decision they don't know what to do with," he said, sliding one of the coffees across the table as she sat down. "That obvious. You get a very specific expression," he said. "Somewhere between terrified and furious. I've only seen it twice before. Once during the worst night of my life. Once during a briefing about updated flight safety regulations that honestly should not have provoked that reaction." She almost smiled, despite everything. "Holloway offered me a position," she said. "Liaison to the Oversight Committee. Permanent. Means leaving Ironvale." Reyes was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between them. "You going to take it?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted for the second time that day. "Everyone keeps asking me that like I'm supposed to have already decided." "Maybe you have," Reyes said. "Maybe you're just not ready to say it out loud yet." She looked at him across the small table, at a man who'd trusted her voice completely during the worst 10 minutes of both their lives, who'd never once, in the months since, treated her like the disgraced pilot. Everyone else at Ironvale had spent 3 years believing she was. "What would you do?" she asked. "If it were you." "I already made that decision," he said quietly. "The day I decided flying combat missions wasn't worth what it cost me to stop hearing my own hydraulics failing every time I closed my eyes. Doesn't mean it's the right decision for you. Just means I understand what it feels like to choose something different than what everyone expects." "You don't regret it," she said, leaving the cockpit. "Some days," he admitted. "Most days, no. Most days I think about what would have happened if I hadn't had somebody in my ear telling me exactly how to survive something I had no business surviving. And I think maybe teaching the next kid to have that same steady voice matters just as much as flying ever did." Callan sat with that for a long moment, watching steam curl up off her coffee, watching the small diner's evening crowd move through their ordinary lives, entirely unaware of everything that had nearly happened 6 months ago in the sky above them. "Come with me," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it out loud. "If I take the position, there'd be a training component. Somebody who understands crisis communication, emergency procedures, the exact kind of steady voice that keeps pilots alive when everything else falls apart. You'd be perfect for it." Reyes looked up, something shifting behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment earlier. You're serious. I don't say things I don't mean, she said. You should know that about me by now. I do know that about you, he said quietly. It's actually one of the reasons I keep showing up here, with 2 coffees instead of 1. The admission hung in the air between them, simple and unguarded in a way that neither of them had quite allowed themselves before. 3 months of quiet coffee dates that had never officially been anything, except 2 people who'd survived something together, and found gradually that they preferred surviving the ordinary parts of life together too. I'll think about it, he said finally. The offer. And the rest of it. Take your time, she said, echoing Holloway's words from that morning without quite meaning to. Some decisions deserve it. 2 weeks later, almost to the day, Callan stood once more at her father's grave, snow melting into slush beneath a sky that had finally, after 6 months, stopped feeling like something waiting to hurt her. She'd made her decision 3 days earlier, signed the paperwork, accepted the position, effective the following month, with a training component built into the role that Holloway had personally guaranteed her the authority to structure however she saw fit. Reyes had said yes the day after that. I want you to know something, she said quietly to the headstone, to the man who'd spent 8 years unable to tell her any of this himself. I'm not running from Iron Vale. I'm running toward exactly what you were trying to protect. The truth. Making sure nobody else's daughter spends 8 years grieving a lie. The wind moved gently through the cemetery, carrying nothing but the ordinary sound of a quiet winter afternoon. I think you'd like him, she added, after a moment, thinking of Reyes waiting for her in the car, giving her space for this exact conversation without ever needing to be asked. Args. He's got your kind of calm. The kind that keeps people alive when everything else is falling apart. She stayed a while longer, long enough for the cold to settle into her bones, long enough that the particular ache of missing him had transformed slowly, over 6 months, into something gentler, not gone, never entirely gone, but bearable now, in a way it hadn't been before she'd finally learned the truth. When she finally turned to leave, Reyes was standing a respectful distance away, hands in his jacket pockets, waiting without impatience, the way he always seemed to wait for her. Ready? He asked. She looked back once more at her father's headstone, at the corrected record that finally told the truth about a man who'd given everything to protect it, and felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled for the better part of a decade. Ready, she confirmed. They walked back to the car together, boots crunching through melting snow, and somewhere above them, the Alaskan sky stretched wide and clear and endlessly patient, the way it always had, the way it always would, holding its secrets and its storms and its rare, hard-won moments of peace in equal measure. Behind them, Iron Vale waited. A new chapter, a new title, a new voice in her ear that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with choosing, finally, exactly the life she wanted to build. Ahead of them, the road stretched south, toward Washington, toward an oversight committee and a training program and a future neither of them could have imagined 6 months earlier, standing on opposite ends of a storm that had nearly killed them both. But that was tomorrow's story. Today, for once, there was nothing chasing her, nothing hunting, nothing left to prove to anyone who hadn't already decided, long before she ever climbed into a cockpit, exactly who she was. Just a woman. A man who understood exactly what she'd survived, and a long, quiet drive south beneath a sky that had finally, after everything, let her go.